Asher Koach, Madeline. That was an important Devar Torah, an important teaching, and also, as with everything else that you've done this morning, so beautifully delivered. In your teaching just now, you reminded us that our most sacred texts include practices that many of us find hard to justify and don't believe in. Stoning is a good example, and this week's Torah portion also includes flogging, impaling a person on a stake, and cutting off a woman's hand. It's just as well probably that you left those details out. Like stoning, these punishments make us feel queasy. Parashat Ki Teitzei is smack dab in the middle of Deuteronomy, which means that these laws appear as Moses reiterates a list of earlier laws in the Torah before the Israelites enter the Promised Land. And this week's section of text is kind of like a highlight reel of things that we really don't like in the modern era. Set in a context of conquering a land and destroying its inhabitants, which is by itself troublesome for us as modern readers, the Parsha describes polygamy and sexual violence, prostitution, leprosy is mentioned for good measure, because why not? The commandment to obliterate our enemies also appears here, and in a nod to what you taught us, the Torah portion even commands us to stone our children to death when they misbehave. Right. But you, Madeline, took this Parsha and drew us to think about such important truths. In your treatment of the Jewish approach to capital punishment, you offer us multiple rabbinic texts that remind us of how our ancient sages didn't like the idea of capital punishment and found ways to make it inadmissible under Jewish law. Though there are minority halachic arguments in favor of a secular death penalty, almost all Jewish authorities agree across the denominations that it is wrong. And even 2,000 years ago, rabbis worked their rabbinic magic to make obsolete these earlier laws in the Torah. You refer to a famous passage in the Talmud from Tractate Sanhedrin that reaches this conclusion by addressing what we find in this week's Torah portion, the wayward and rebellious son that we're commanded to stone. The sages go through all kinds of mental gymnastics, and you gave us just a taste of them trying to limit the category of a son who is liable for the death penalty. First, they say he has to be a son and not a daughter. Then they say he has to be at a certain age, and he has to have committed the crime in a specific way, and he has to have been a drunkard and a glutton, and then his parents have to have all kinds of specific behaviors too, and his mother even has to have a beard, and so on. They play around with it, and they basically make it so this kind of guy is impossible to be, and it's actually effectively impossible to then have to stone your child to death. It never was, and it never will be. Lo hayav lo yihiyeh is the way that it's phrased. The rabbis famously teach that. And according to these sages, the only reasons why the Torah would ever include such a strict punishment was to invite later readers, like you and me, to use our legal cleverness to reason out of existence these things as if they were always theoretical. They do this all the time, by the way. Anytime the rabbis don't like something, they make things up and reason it out of existence, and so be it. That's how they end things. But the problem is this. Here's the thing. We know that in plenty of cases, early Jews, and certainly Israelites, did invoke the death penalty. And at the end of the Talmudic discussion about this wayward and rebellious son, one rabbi admits that it happened. I saw this happen, Rabbi Yonatan says, and I sat on his grave. So after all these rabbis try to say it didn't happen, it was just theoretical, this rabbi, Rabbi Yonatan, says it did. And a medieval gloss on this famous Talmudic text points out that Rabbi Yonatan was from a priestly family. He was a Kohen. And therefore, he could not have sat on a grave. He could not have entered a graveyard even unless he was attending a funeral for a close loved one, which implies that he, Rabbi Yonatan, sat on the grave of his own son, whom he had to stone to death, because he had followed the Torah's earlier command. It's a really raw and painful moment that interrupts the playfulness of the rabbis as they argue ad absurdum about the death penalty. He actually did it. And after hearing all the reasons why his colleagues explained that this thing in the Torah didn't happen because they didn't want to believe it was so, Rabbi Yonatan proves that it actually was. Words have consequences. They are rarely just abstractions. And even if the Talmudic sages say that the purpose of the Torah's words in this case was to invite us to study and grapple, sometimes we have to acknowledge the danger of saying something when we expect that it may never actually happen. Because frequently that thing does happen and can even have life or death consequences. That's true when it comes to capital punishment, and it's true in so many ways. This Shabbat, I'm thinking about the theoretical becoming real as it relates to the situation in Afghanistan. As we read the news of the American military withdrawing, many of us are watching in horror as 20 years of war ends in more bloodshed and the prospect for so much worse. We pray that the Afghan people are able to build a more just future for themselves than currently seems possible at all. And I pray that we as Americans will grapple sincerely with the facts on the ground that until recently felt so far off. In the coming weeks, we'll call on our government to protect as many people as possible from the imminent threat of fundamentalism, especially those who risk their lives to protect American interests and lives over the past 2 decades. As many innocent Afghans as possible. But above all, as we consider how and why we got into Afghanistan in the first place, it's worth remembering this basic lesson from Rabbi Yonatan, addressing his colleagues about the death penalty. That when we think something is abstract or far away, it may not really be so. Even our best, most sacred intentions can move us toward human mistakes. It seems like rhetoric or simply political debate or disagreement often has a real impact on people's lives. And usually they're people that privileged Americans don't know and can't see. This Torah portion was not in its time theoretical. Even if it does include so many things that we can't imagine being real today, it was then a guide for behavior. Not just vis-a-vis capital punishment or issues of adultery, but above all, this parsha actually focuses on war. Teitzei, the first 2 words of this parsha from which it takes its name, are followed by the word lemilchama. Its very first words mean when you go out to war. And what follows is a set of instructions for when the Israelites did just that. Even if the Torah's context was far from what the rabbis themselves experienced, the Torah text was not really written to be theoretical. And now, as we confront the reality of a war that for 20 years felt theoretical, to many of us, especially here in Brooklyn, we're thrust back into realizing just how real it always has been. And as Rabbi Yonatan reminds us, we can't just avoid historical or distant truth by abstracting it from our local reality. It's okay to be confused and sad about all of this news. It's okay to sit with the discomfort of not knowing whom to blame or maybe even blaming our own chosen leaders. But ultimately, following Rabbi Yonatan's example, the key in whatever we do is to sit and to grieve and also to witness and name in the service of telling the truth. We can change some rules like capital punishment. We can make different decisions, as we hopefully will when the prospect of another war comes into view. But we must learn from the reality of what we have wrought as Americans, both here and with the news this week, what we've pursued abroad. And as we consider all of it, reading this Torah portion and imagining a better world that we can build, may we confront our past. May we find better answers. May we grieve together. And in order to do all of that, may we understand the very real power we have and use it to move forward. Shabbat shalom.